Well, good afternoon. Why don't we start? You know this is a panel that is focused on polarization, and you know that this is a moment which, although it's been very much the focus in the United States as of the last year or so, this is something that in fact is not confined to the United States. And here, you will know, at least in the context of the United States, that the issue of polarization has commanded a great deal of attention. The Pew Research Center says that American people are more divided along ideological lines than any other point in recent history, so that this is something that is qualitatively different, so the story goes, than what we've seen in the past. Americans' trust in each other and confidence in institutions has reached historic lows. This is true since the questions have been asked by the Pew starting in the 1960s and the 70s. Americans are separating themselves into homogeneous enclaves. They are more likely to live near each other, worship near each other, and socialize near each other with those who are similar to them and who share their views. So we're seeing a very strong enclave effect. And we know that there's a growing percentage of Republicans and Democrats who would be upset if one of their children were to marry a child of a family of the other party. This is how polarized the United States has become. And most distressing, the party's positions are hardening on a host of different issues, and increasingly, many party members see the other party's position not just as flawed or wrong, but as bad or as dangerous for America. Recent surveys have shown a similar rise in distrust in government, in civic institutions, and science across Europe. To quote a recent passage from The Guardian, the home to one of our panelists, "What is on the march across Europe might not be the far-right movement as such, but, quote, distrust, disillusion, and even full-scale rejection of the political establishment." We're also at a moment, of course, when wrenching technological and social change, and in particular the splintering and self-curation of media platforms, is entangled in these trends. And this is not just about social media. There's been so much attention to social media, but in fact, at least in the United States, as Yuri referred to a moment ago, the sorting of citizens into parties and corresponding cable news networks, Fox for Republicans, CNN and MSNBC for Democrats, was a very important factor in the last election. But as you saw from the last panel, this is also a moment for all these trends where science and technology is starting to teach us a great deal about the root causes of division and polarization. It turns out that we're greatly vulnerable to motivational reasoning. That is, we form and hold our positions less on dispassionate analytical view of any issue, but more on in-group or tribal identities. If the party of which I am a member states a position on an issue, then even if I have facts available to me that disprove that position, I will still be inclined to hold my original position. The prospect of taking a position that would reduce ties to my group is just simply too great to me psychologically to take that step. This science is upending our assumptions about how people engage and interact. Independent facts, independent experts are not enough to force us to change our views. However, as we understand more deeply the role of these psychological and social processes that explain these behaviors, there is also the possibility that we can develop new techniques that allow us to soften people's hardened positions, create moments of engagement, and also fuel possible solutions. This is the direction I'm hoping this panel can go in today. You have already heard that we've got 3 outstanding panelists. You've already heard from Yuri, so rather than belaboring introductions here that would take away from discussion, I would like to turn it over to the panelists to answer a first question of mine. Again, I urge all of you to send in questions to me. I have the magic iPad, which will surface questions that you raise, and I can pose them to the panelists in the course of our discussion. So with that, and to get our panelists started, I'm wondering if we can focus first on what we understand about the new science that is being produced and what it says for how hardened people's positions are, and what is the prospect that we can find ways to dig ourselves out of these very entrenched positions through some kinds of intervention, some kind of change in political institutions, some kind of change. What can we do with this science? What does the science tell us? What surprises you about the science? And then we'll explore how we can think about using it to make change. Do you want to start, Rachel?
Sure. So we just heard a lot about the brain, and Ron mentioned just now motivated reasoning. And I think one of the core things, we're all walking around with brains in our head. That's something we all have in common. And what we're seeing now, even though science may be teaching us new things about it, isn't fundamentally new. We're still walking around with pretty similar wiring to the wiring we had 50 years ago, 100 years ago. But what's happening is that the environment around us has changed. So when we start to see things that look new on social media, it's actually our psychology, our brains are now interacting in a new context. So we have this motivated reasoning. And we have a lot of different cognitive biases where when we're reasoning, when we're looking for information, we want to find things that agree with us and that affirm our sense of self and our identity and help. And when we receive information, facts, otherwise arguments that disagree with our fundamental beliefs, we actually interpret it as a psychological threat. And so we put up a lot of defenses to argue against them and reject them. Now, we mentioned social media, for example. It's not that it's fundamentally new that we seek information that helps affirm ourselves, our identity, our group belonging. But what is fundamentally new is that we have all these new tools to do it with. So on social media, we have a wider variety of choices to make between different news sources, different stories that we can believe in. And so you have that fundamental psychology and brain wiring coming to meet a new environment that enables us to polarize ourselves more and be more and more selective about the news and information we consume to reinforce our existing beliefs and sense of self. And then at the same time, what we see is, I think, people agreeing with and expressing information that they agree with as a way to mark their identity, as a way to say, I watch this news station or read this newspaper and it means I'm part of this group, or I believe this set of facts or this interpretation, and that's a way for me to signal I'm conservative, I'm liberal, I'm us, I'm them. And so we use information and communication and expression in all these different ways to to say which group we belong to. And I think what we're seeing in the US, for example, is that our debates and discussions have for a long time been moving away from discussion about ideas and the sense that we're all American, we're all working in the same framework, but we're going to disagree about and debate ideas. And instead, we've been pushed into debating our identity, who we are. And so when that transition from I'm going to share about my beliefs or communicate a certain set of beliefs or facts, from it being about ideas to it being about an expression of who we are and who our in-group or our out-group is, I think is really a signal that we are becoming very, very polarized.
Can you give us, a sense, the story that Rachel's telling here is that this is very much a core part of humanity that we're understanding. 'Twas always so, but what's just changing is the environment in which we operate, that there's now new techniques where we can foster and reinforce, affirm these in-group identities. And so it's not that our hardwiring has changed, but it's rather the external environment in which we operate. Is that right?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. I think it's true our brains is not evolving in this rapid scale, right? So basically we have the same brain and the society is changing. And I think what also is changing is that there are powerful people that controlling and gaining from this polarization. So I think it's not only social media and the echo chamber effect, which is definitely part of it. I think there are also some people that challenging information and give us these biases and gain from this like fractured society. And again, the way to solve it is to come with a common ground, right? And to decide about a mechanism to decide about the facts. And that's like democracy. This is not a neuroscientific or scientific problem. This is a social problem. So only you, the brains that operate in the society, can fix it. It's not that the scientists will come and tell you how to fix it. We can see how this mechanism is working, and you saw that even if it's like simple case of an affair, I can create your brain to respond in a very different way based on the information. So you have these tendencies to cluster together and think in the same way to your group. That's how we are wired. I'm putting a force on your brain, you're putting a force on my brain. So we can see these forces at play, but how to deal with them and control them, and this is a political issue, and this is a social issue, and I'm feeling that something in our society is breaking apart because it's fine for us not to talk about the facts, but to talk about our identities. I think this is the source of the problem.
This is what Rachel was focused on. But why is it that we have moved to a point in which we have taken on exclusive identities? That is to say, there was a large political science, indeed philosophical literature over the last several decades that talked about the fact that we as humans don't like to be pigeonholed. We like multiple identities. I'm a law professor, but I also happen to be someone who likes this or that sport, who also happens to be a foodie, who has these political views. I don't want to be pigeonholed. I don't want to be confined to any particular exclusive association. And that seemed to be something that was taken to be a very real expression of human aspiration and human temperament. Why do we find ourselves devolving into this world in which, again, we have to live, work, worship, even marry the people within this same self-defined tribe, and why do we find that satisfying?
It's a really good question, and in a way, based on this description of humanity, Trump should not have won, right? Because he was going against so many minorities and so many, he targeted one audience in a way in his campaign, right? But it worked. And the question is, why did it work? Under your assumption, he should not have won the election. And I think post-election, I think what we need to understand, I think that came apart in the previous discussion. We live in a world that we have global problems, but we're thinking about them in a local politics way. And when we have global problems and the tools that we are facing, trying to impose are not fitting the solution, things are going to break. And when people feel unsafe, they will go to the safe place. And that can lead to a very strange dynamic. And I think in the dynamical system, and we all working in the dynamical system because your brains are part of my brain, right? So this is the dynamical system. Dynamic system can be in stable places or unstable places. And I think now when we go to this unstable new place, many things can happen. Think about World War II, when 60 million people died in 5 years. This is a crazy dynamical state. But it happened, and we're like humans, and with the same brain, 70 years ago, in a completely crazy dynamic. So I think once you start to understand that the brain can go in different states, you see what's at stake, and you want to make the dynamic more balanced, but it's very difficult to control, and we might go, because the problems are global and so complicated, we might go to very strange places.
Matt, tell us a bit about how this is playing out in Europe. Again, so much of this debate now has been dominated over the last year by what's going on in the United States. But is this idiosyncratic, or in fact, is this something that is of global import?
Yes, I think you have to look to the the economics of the online economy, which are ultimately attention. Facebook and Google, they maybe have good kind of purposes at their heart, but ultimately the reason they exist is to drive attention so that they can get your eyeballs to look at advertising to earn them billions of dollars every quarter. And attention doesn't necessarily favor, complex news stories that go into depth about what's going on in a community and about what's going on in society. They favor viral clickbait, which is kind of usually quite aggressive, usually opinion-led, usually kind of quite polarizing in its nature.
But it's not like we didn't have a yellow journalism before social media. I mean, we grew up in a world, and indeed from the earliest days, the press, particularly in the United States, was extremely, irresponsible, was very incendiary in terms of the positions it took on. So, I mean, this has been with us for a while. It's not like everyone was reading The Guardian and the New York Times until a few years ago when Facebook and Google came into our lives.
This is true, but it's also, there's a couple of things happening. One is the economics are changing. So in the UK, for every £31 that we've lost in advertising, we've gained £1 in digital advertising. The rest of that money has just gone to online platforms. So there just isn't the money to spend on news stories and investigations that helped kind of build trust in a brand and build trust in the media. So I think people are starting to not be able to tell the difference between different news brands, and it just looks like noise shouting at them, and they can't really work out who to trust. And I think that's a really significant problem. But I also think that, especially with a news feed, you're being fed content which completely sits in your sweet spot on your attitudinal base. You're not going out to find it, it's just coming at you all the time, and it's always there. And I think there is something about that which is different from the way that you used to have to actively go out and buy a newspaper or even actively go to a website. This is kind of there all the time, and I think that is changing the way that people are interacting with news and changing their relationship with news.
Tell us a bit about political actors and how they are exploiting this environment. That is to say, again, we have innate human propensities. We've seen some new instruments like social media and changes in the incentives for media, the capabilities of media. But where we're most concerned about this is in a political environment, and here we have to talk about political leadership. And there's a piece in today's or yesterday's New York Times, an op-ed in which the lamentation is about the lack of good moral leadership, that only if we could produce a moral leader, somehow we would find our way out of this. It seems simplistic, but again, it does underscore that political actors are very much part of this ecosystem and are exploiting this environment for their objectives.
So I think politics used to be about telling big stories and having big principles and standing up for them with the electorate. I think we're now in a phase where the data that's generated from your activities in the online world, there's 98 data points on everybody in this room that are used by marketers to target specific products at you. So whether you're a football fan or whether you like beer or you like wine, you'll get different messages. And politics has moved from being about telling big stories to connect with people to actually telling very small messages to individual groups and targeting them kind of behind closed doors in the dark to try and get them to come out and vote. What was really interesting in the UK election was that the Conservatives went into that election thinking they were going to get a barnstorming majority, that Theresa May will be able to push Brexit through with no problem. It didn't work out like that, because actually, from the left, Jeremy Corbyn came along, quite an unconventional, modern Labour politician, telling stories, meeting people, trying to relate to people's lives, and explaining actually there is a life that's better than what you have now. And that kind of struck a chord because it's so different from what politics has become, which is completely desiccated and completely kind of narrow in its form.
So just to go back to what Rachel and Uri said, that if you think about just what happened with Brexit, at one level, it's a story that, for many commentators, this just has the realm of being a massive mistake. People were uninformed, they indulged something that was not well thought out, and ultimately there was some sort of appeal to tribal identities, fear of outsider, fear of consequences if the state prerogatives weren't reinforced, and that gets us to this point. Was there, if you look back, was there a media strategy? Was there the capability, do you think, of media playing a role in having better informed the electorate, of better preparing them for the decision, or ultimately, even with a lot of attention and care, people were still going to vote with their fears?
So the biggest moment of hubris was David Cameron thinking that in 1 year he could change the minds of the British electorate that Europe wasn't a bad thing. Europe has been portrayed in the media for decades as calling for banning bendy bananas and all sorts of kind of myths that are propagated about Europe, kind of bizarre myths. I think the communications on this should have started a long time ago. I think the mistake that has been made is thinking that Brexit was just about the European Union or just about immigration, when actually it's wrapped up with a whole bunch of other issues that have just been ignored. So globalization and the impact that globalization is having on communities. Yes, immigration, but fundamentally the issue with immigration is about people taking jobs. And that leads you to kind of AI and technology and what that's going to do to whole industries. So I think politicians probably missed the fact that Brexit is an exceptionally complicated story. It's not one thing. And it goes back to your point about people are very complex. People have got lots of different reasons for voting the way they did. This most recent UK election, what you saw was a lot of people who voted Leave, who for UKIP, which is the most right-wing kind of party in the UK, a lot of those people came back to Labour because what Labour was promising was kind of big, free education, free childcare, more money for the NHS. So people were won back by this idea that there is a better future and that austerity will end.
Rachel, this story is obviously disquieting and bleak, and again, the social media figures prominently as being a mechanism by which this problem of polarization and sort of the appeal to base instincts rather than to our better angels is being accommodated. But you've done some really interesting work where you've actually sought to upend the perception of what can be done with social media. And in fact, you've used social media in a number of different contexts to bring out empathy, engagement, and try and temper this in-group behavior. Do you want to talk a bit about that? I think it would be wonderful to get some of the examples that you've been involved with, because it gives us a more optimistic view on how we find our way out of this.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, polarization has a lot of negative feedback loops. Once it starts to exist, it tends to worsen itself. But there are openings where we can start to do work. I got involved first with this work in Kenya, and just like we've been talking about, it was after the 2007-2008 post-election violence. And it was actually cell phones and text messages during the post-election violence that helped amplify fears, rumors, misinformation, and helped lead to the violence really by preparing people for it and helping, again, increase the fear that they felt for other groups. So we did a lot of different work over the years that I was there. We actually...
You should say who the we is.
Oh, so I had an organization called CC Niamani Kenya. It means We Are Peace Kenya. And again, it's the same thing. It was the same hardwiring and the same, we'd seen conflict over and over again around elections in Kenya. The phones were new. They let information spread faster than ever before, and they let it spread across distances. So if you were in an urban area and there was fighting, you could ask someone in a rural area from your same tribe to take revenge. So as we prepared for an upcoming election, we started thinking, well, what could we do to undermine this? We decided to use the same tool. We went door to door. We got 65,000 people signed up to a text messaging platform, and we reached out to them based on where they were, their neighborhood, and worked with local peace activists on the ground to really understand what mattered to them. And the first big thing I'll say about how we climb back out of where we are, we have to start by understanding people. It wasn't by telling people that they should love each other, that violence was bad, that we attempted to influence them. When we really got on the ground and talked to them, we realized it mattered to them that violence would prevent them from selling things at their business. It mattered to them that they didn't want to be manipulated by politicians so that politicians could gain while they fought. So we really crafted our messaging based on understanding that people are rational actors. It might not make sense to us why someone's acting the way they are, but it certainly makes sense to them, and we need to understand where they're coming from. But, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Another key thing we did was we held political debates, and it's interesting to me to look back on it now. In Kenya, a lot of the election-related conflict is based on tribe. And like I was talking about before, that's the idea that we are fundamentally different. If we're from different tribes, our interest is in competition with each other because we're somehow different. And if my leader gets elected, they're going to represent me and take care of me. But if your leader gets elected, they'll take care of you. And looking at the US and how we talked about ideas in politics, one of the things we did was do political debates to just show people you could also talk about really local issues, drainage lines, infrastructure, things like that, that no matter what tribe someone was from, they wanted it to see it changed in their community. So when I look at the US right now, I think we're actually becoming a little bit more like Kenya in that we're backing into these tribal identities, and I do think one way out is, can you start to help people find common ground around really tangible issues that they have, not with the language of politics and polarization, but by starting out talking about something as simple as a sewage line.
Do you worry, just going back to the Kenya case, that if I'm one of the rival parties who's seeking to deploy instruments of hate, fear, in-group identities, and you have some NGO that steps into this that is going to ultimately undercut my message? You know, maybe they were surprised in the first election when this happened, but will they be better the next time out? That is to say, to discredit what the NGO was doing. And again, we've seen in a number of different countries efforts by governments to marginalize, particularly NGOs that interfere with electoral processes, where it, particularly has adverse impacts on the incumbent government. So is this a one-trick situation where that it's ephemeral, and do you have concerns about your ability to do this again in Kenya or to take it on the road in other settings?
Yeah, so the answer is both yes and no. Yes, I think I am worried. I think always I look at communication, whether it's the message, how it's delivered, who it's delivered from, as a tool. And it's a tool that can be used in a lot of different ways. It can be used to divide or to unite. And so I think that people who are using this as a tool for the purposes of division or personal, political, or other types of gain will always continue to get better and more strategic at it. And I think that for us, it can't just be a one-time show. We have to be doing the same. We have to be studying and understanding how communication is being used negatively, and we have to keep getting better at how we use it. So after being in Kenya for the last 3 years or so, my work has been figuring out how can we take from marketing, from work like what Yuri's doing, from social psychology, and try and better understand human nature and how we interact with communication so that we can keep getting better. Because if we don't keep getting better, and if we don't keep getting more strategic, we will lose.
Yuri, I guess I'm wondering, just based on what Rachel said a moment ago, so she has this intervention that they had successfully deployed in Kenya, which seems to be reminding people of the value of autonomy, of trying to, in some sense, indulge reason rather than emotion, and doing this in the context of a contested election. Can we imagine that there's a civics program, or the civics 2.0, which we want to take into classrooms across the industrialized democracies, where basically you would be trying to inoculate kids with the world in which they're going out to and the ways in which different political leaders, other people who are in positions where they can influence opinion, can we essentially do things, provide techniques, give them a sense of the ways in which their emotions might be exploited that will create resistance or resilience to what's going to come down the line? Will this work?
Yes, I think it has to work, but it's a big challenge. I will answer your question by also jumping to what you were saying before. In a new context, I think that if I'm thinking about what Fox News did something very effective for his audience by polarization, so he gained a lot. The New York Times, now after the elections, do the same act, way polarize his opinions, and he get a lot of money out of it. So in a way, you can see that the media is part of the problem in the sense that it also tends to polarize because there are many forces that gain from this polarization. Even the liberal forces gain, and we don't tend to see this. And I think what the biggest problem, and that's related to the education, that we lost the ability now, if I cannot trust Fox News or the New York Times to understand reality, because the reality is filtered so heavily by their motives, then who should I trust? How can we as a simple people can get to the truth, to know what is true and what is not? And because the problems are so complicated and the science is so complicated, we were thinking at the beginning, internet will solve everything. Now everyone has the access to the information, but actually that's not what's happening because the problems are so global and serious, and we not have basically common ground that is agreed by all parties. This is the source to get the reality, to decide about the facts. It's going to break. And so when you talk about education, it's like, it's education to be skeptic, it's education about not trust one media channel, listening to the other side.
But does this work? That is to say, is there a module that you could provide that would say to kids in primary school and high school, get ready. You're already deeply immersed in a social media environment, but trying to discern truth, trying to develop independent analytical skills, a skepticism about rhetoric. Matt, Eves?
So we have a foundation, unsurprisingly called the Guardian Foundation, which runs these classes for kids. We've got an education centre in the newsroom. We bring classes of kids in every day. I think we've had 180,000 children through it so far. They come out of it with a strong sense, actually, of critical and analytical skills, and we hope we're sort of inspiring the next generation of journalists through that process. And what we're looking to do is expand that and take that out. We've already run a pilot scheme about taking that out to more schools in the country because we've got 250 schools on the waiting list for that program. So I think there are things that you can do. To your other point, though, I think there's a report out today from the Reuters News Institute, which I would highly recommend, which is an analysis of how people consume news nowadays, what their trust is in news, and what they think about fake news. And one of the issues that comes out is that in countries where there is less polarization, what you have is a strong media organization at the center. And in the UK, we have the BBC, which is a huge intervention in the market, but is also a huge meeting point of lots of different views. And in societies where you have that strong meeting point, people are less likely to kind of diverge to the left and the right, and more likely to have a kind of common sense of what a society is about. Now, you don't have that in the US. There's a bubble chart, which, again, I would advise you to read, where you just have left and right and nothing in the middle. And I think that's problematic, I think.
So do you have a sense on this work that you're doing through the foundation that these kinds of training modules have durable effect? That is, it's more than just, that for the time that the kids are in the program that they have this heightened sensitivity. Do you have a sense that, again, on my sort of metaphor of inoculation, that this has persistent effects?
So the good news is that the people who are really susceptible to fake news and bad things online are the older generation. The bad news is the older generation is dying, so they won't be with us forever. The good news is that the younger generation are much more savvy about using technology online and understanding what's going on. So I think, I'm not saying the Guardian Foundation is going to solve every problem that we've got in the world, but I think through those sort of classes and hopefully by working with kind of other partnerships, we can expand those out.
Again, I want to come back to, with the panelists here, you know, this question of how did we get here? Again, I'm very moved by the neuroscience that Yuri has illuminated for us and others have, and really seen what our innate propensities are. But having said that, as I said at the outset of the session, 'twas always so. So why is this qualitatively different at this point in time? You know, one can say that this is a story about social media. One can say that this is a story of failed political institutions. In the United States, there's a lot of writing that's going on now about trying to, once again, think about changing rules on campaign finance and limiting the ability of Congress to perpetuate themselves in power through gerrymandering districts and so forth. So there's a story here about failures in political institutions. But there's another story here that goes to the global economy, and in particular its propensity to exacerbate rather than to mitigate inequality. And so that what has really created vulnerability here, according to some, is just that we're in a world of much starker income inequality, and that breeds extremism. So how much do you think that is a part of the story here, and what makes us particularly invulnerable, and what makes this brew so toxic? And Matt, I'd start with you on that.
So again, looking at the data from the UK election, what's counterintuitive is that the most educated voters went for vote for the Labour Party in this last election, and it's a really clear pattern that's emerging. The people who are least well off voted for the Conservatives, who were basically pledging more austerity, but had vowed to cut immigration and leave the EU. So it's quite a complex picture, because you would think that the people who are worst off would vote for the party who was going to give them most. It's quite hard, I think, to unpack how that, you know, whether that will change over time once the kind of Brexit issue is gone. But yeah, it's complicated.
So I got the proverbial hook to close the session. But what I'd like to do with our panelists before we conclude is just to do a lightning round and ask you just the following question. If you could suggest one intervention that you think at this point in time would be particularly effective in ameliorating polarization, fragmentation, distrust, and have us concentrate on one thing to address this issue, what would that be? Rachel, you want to start us?
Yeah. So thinking about the US, a lot of places where I've gone to work that have progressed towards conflict, the biggest barrier to doing anything is that there aren't credible speakers. There aren't people who can credibly speak out and reach beyond the polarization and beyond very specific groups. Also, the more people get pushed into, we all have this innate desire to belong. We all want to be part of a group. And the more that we have these singular and rigid identities like liberal and conservative, the harder it is for us to disagree with our own group, because we don't have anywhere to land in the middle. So once I've left my group, I can't land somewhere in here like the bubble chart Matt was just talking about. It's blank space. I don't have anywhere to belong unless I'm on an extreme. I think we're early enough in the process in the US of this polarization that we can really start to protect that middle ground. I think we need to elevate and work with voices along the political spectrum to really keep a gray area there, so that when people do disagree with members of their own in-group, the social pressure to agree and go along with it, and the social consequences of saying something that might get you ostracized or ridiculed by your own group are lessened by the fact that you can now belong to other groups sort of along that spectrum. So we need to enable this multiplicity of identities, and we really need to protect and cultivate and grow the gray area and the gray space in our politics.
I agree with everything you said, so I will simply add something else. I have two comments that might help. One is, I think there need to be a structural change, definitely in the US, in the way we fund politics. I think you always ask who the politicians are serving, and I think more and more people are feeling that they are not serving us, the voters. They are serving like power groups, and only like they come to us in the day of elections, say blah blah blah, but then they're going to do something that is not. They are not serving us. So that's something you need to change the funding structure. Otherwise, democracy will fall apart. And another thing I think we have to we have to establish a media that will give us not take sides, but give us the facts, and we all go. So if we have it in the US, in the UK with the BBC, that's exactly what we need all around. We need something that will be the core center of our society, that we go and listen and talk and decide about the facts.
So at the moment, the use of personal data gathered on digital platforms is completely unregulated, certainly in the UK. I think regulating that and stopping political parties from using that and targeting people very, very narrowly would lead people to, guess what, start having conversations with the public. And I think if they start doing that, then I think politics would be in a much better place.
Great. On behalf of everyone here, thank you to our panelists.